What is going down, my YouTube family? It is your boy Zeri, and we are back with a Raid Shadow Legends video today, and we are going to talk about things that have to do with Doom Tower. I still haven't beat the Banner Lords, but I haven't pulled any shards. We got a 10 times event going on right now. I'm personally not pulling for that. I got enough projects to work on right now, and none of the characters are really super interesting to me. I mean, I'd pretty much take any of them, don't get me wrong, but I'd rather wait for a double times event. And it got me thinking, you know, I'm really enjoying the Doom Tower, but it got me thinking that a lot of people don't have legendaries. Like, I had ungodly lucky pulls, we all know that. I have this account kind of built up. In my other account, I got one legendary. I don't even have really very many good epics yet, so you know, when you're early game and you're trying out the Doom Tower, we're going to take a look at each faction. We're going to talk about 3 characters from each faction that could help you out, right? And of the rare variety. It's going to be rare champions that could provide certain things for Doom Tower. Because as I'm going through this Doom Tower, the hero collector in me is thinking, what do I need? We need, you know, obviously nukers, either single target or AoE, right? We need anybody who can provide crowd control. We need, you know, the debuffs of decreased speed, decreased attack, decreased defense. We need revivers and healers. So what are some champions that you might pull out of a mystery shard, right? That you could use? That I think it's like a 1% chance, but you get hundreds of these mystery shards, and we're going to talk about champions that could really benefit us in the Doom Tower that you might want to think. They're easier to book, we get more rare books. Some of these champions are farmable, and yeah, some of them you probably already know, but I need to talk about them. I need to mention them. So we're going to jump into this, and if their abilities aren't very good, like if their A1 sucks, I'm just going to move on. I'm not going to go over their whole kit here. So let's jump into 3 rares. I tried to stay clear of voids, but one void from each faction. Sometimes if there's somebody extremely good, 2 of them in the same faction, I have to mention them both. But it's 3, and then there's a couple honorable mentions in there. So let's get into it. So we have quite a few factions here. We are going to start with Banner Lords. First champion we're going to talk about is Valerie. Valerie's A1 isn't anything spectacular, but her A2 increases the duration of all buffs on all allies for 1 turn. Also decreases the duration of all debuffs on allies by 1 turn. So she can bring down that poison from the spider, she can extend the shield, and then she's also giving a 25% increased attack buff to all allies for 2 turns. And it's on a 3-turn cooldown. And her A3 as well places a shield buff on all allies for 2 turns. The value of the shield depends on this champion's level. Heals each ally according to the number of buffs they are currently under. Next one on the list for Banner Lords is Courtier. And he's an attack-based champion, so it's going to be harder to keep him alive. He's kind of slower at 92 speed, but he attacks one enemy, has a 25% chance of placing a freeze debuff for 1 turn, so it's a form of crowd control on his A1. A2 attacks one enemy 3 times. When booked, this is a 35% chance of removing 1 random buff from the target. Pretty big, and it's on a 3-turn cooldown. And then his A3, he attacks all enemies 2 times, has a 33% chance of placing a 30% decreased speed debuff for 2 turns. Next one up is Conqueror. Conqueror is another attack-based champion, but he's a little bit faster, and his A1 hits twice, so you're doing a little bit more damage just simply out of your A1. He attacks one enemy on his A2 and removes 2 buffs from the target on a 2-turn cooldown when he's booked. Not bad. And then attacks one enemy. Enemies killed by this skill cannot be revived, so he has a block revive on a 3-turn cooldown when it's booked. And then the other cool thing about him is he has increased ally attack in all battles by 18%, so you can use him as a lead in faction wars, which you might be missing. We are on to High Elves, and we have to start with Apothecary. He is just so good. He has the double hitter on his or 3-hitter on his A1. Okay, then heals a target by 35% of the HP. This this heal can be critical on a 2-turn cooldown, so you can stack him with crit chance, crit rate, and he has a 106 speed to start. Awesome. And then he places a 30% increased speed buff on all allies for 2 turns and fills the turn meter of all allies by 25% on a 3-turn cooldown when he's booked. The next one from High Elves I want to talk about is Fencer. Fencer on her A1 attacks 1 enemy 2 times. Each hit is a 15% chance. When that's booked, it can go up to 30% of placing a 15% decreased speed debuff for 2 turns, so slowing the enemy down. On her A2, attacks 1 enemy, has a 75% chance of placing a stun debuff, and when this is booked, it's 100% for 1 turn. And then she steals 20% of the target's turn meter if the debuff is not placed. So if that stun is in place, you don't have it fully booked out yet, or they resist it, she's going to take their turn meter. So we got turn meter manipulation with some crowd control, and then attacks all enemies and has a 75% chance, goes up to 100% when booked, of placing a 30% decreased debuff for 2 turns. And that's a 3-turn cooldown. And then we have to talk about Reliquary Tender. Attacks 1 enemy, has a 20% chance. That goes all the way up to a 50% when it's booked, of placing a 25% decrease attack debuff for 2 turns. Then this one. On a 3-turn cooldown when booked, removes all debuffs from all allies and places a 15% continuous heal buff on them for 2 turns. Then her A3, she revives all allies with 30%, or revives an ally with 30% HP and fills their turn meter by 30% on a 5-turn cooldown when it's booked. We are moving on to Sacred Order, and we have Hospitaller. She is a support champion. Her A1 isn't anything special. Her A2, she attacks all enemies and has a 50% chance of removing a random buff from each target. That's a 75% chance when booked on a 4-turn cooldown. Her A3 places a 15% increased speed buff and a 15% increased crit rate buff on all allies for 2 turns on a 3-turn cooldown, so you can really spam that. And then she does have a speed lead. It's only 10%, but it's still speed you can put on your team. Hospitaller could help somebody out. Next one up on Sacred Order is Mother Superior. She attacks 1 enemy, has a 35% chance of placing a 25% decreased attack debuff for 2 turns. She heals an ally by 30% of this champion's max HP, so you want to just load her up with HP. It's a 3-turn cooldown, and then she places a shield buff equal to any surplus healing. So if you heal them up and it goes over healing, it gets converted to shield. That's pretty solid. Pretty solid. Her A3, she places a 7.5% continuous heal buff on all allies for 2 turns and places a shield buff equal to 10% of the target's HP on all allies for 2 turns if the ally's HP is full. And then to kind of top it all off, she increases ally speed in all battles by 13%. So she has another speed lead you can use. She can be beneficial for more than just heals. I like Mother Superior. And I have to talk about Draconis. The Void, he is just really, really good. His A1 attacks 1 enemy, but it heals the ally with the lowest HP by 7.5% of the damage inflicted. And he's based off of HP, so you can just load this guy with HP and speed. Places a shield buff on all allies equal to 15% of this champion's max HP for 2 turns. And then attacks 1 enemy, removes all debuffs from the ally with the lowest health, then heals them for 25% of the damage inflicted on a 4-turn cooldown. Moving on to Barbarians, we have to talk about Marked. She is just a fantastic champion, and she attacks 1 enemy, has a 30% chance, that goes all the way up to 80% when booked, of placing a 30% decreased defense debuff on the enemy for 1 turn, but it's on a basic. Then she attacks all enemies and places a 25% decreased accuracy debuff for 2 turns, so you hopefully won't get that poison. It's on a 3-turn cooldown. Then she places block debuffs on all allies for 1 turn and a 60% increased defense buff on all allies for 2 turns. This is on a 3-turn cooldown also. Next one up is War Maiden, and we all know War Maiden, she's farmable character, but when booked, it's a 3-turn cooldown. She attacks all enemies and places has a 75% chance, which is a 100% chance when booked, of placing the huge version of decreased defense at 60% on all enemies. Then we have Soulbound Bower for our last one in Barbarians, and attacks all enemies on her A1, giving herself more crit chance. She attacks one enemy, has a additional 25% chance of inflicting a crit, but it also ignores 75% of the target's defense, so that is awesome. And attacks one enemy, 25% extra chance to crit, and then has a 75% chance up to 100 when booked of fully depleting the target's turn meter on a 4-turn cooldown. Ogrentribe, Rocktooth, farmable character. His A1, he gets an extra hit if it's critical, so he can deal more damage. Not bad. Attacks all enemies, has a 15% or places a 15% increased crit rate buff on all allies for 1 turn. Definitely usable. And then attacks one enemy and places a 100% heal reduction debuff for 2 turns on a 3-turn cooldown. So you could put that on a boss that heals themselves. Really, really beneficial. You can book them out really easy. Rocktooth. Wagonbane. Wagonbane could be worth investing in because Ogrentribes don't have a lot of healers. So if there's a secret room that requires Ogrentribe, he could come in handy. He attacks one enemy, has a 35% chance of placing a 50% decrease accuracy debuff on for 2 turns. That goes all the way up to a 50% chance when booked. He attacks one enemy. He's placing the 7.5% continuous heal buff on the ally with the lowest HP for 2 turns. And then attacks one enemy and has a 75% chance, 100% chance when booked on a 4-turn cooldown of placing the strong version of decreased defense debuff for 2 turns. Also has a 75% chance of decreasing the target's turn meter by 15%. And I have to finish it off with my main man, Bellower. Just so good. I love Bellower. He attacks all enemies. 30% chance when booked of placing a block cooldown skill debuff for 1 turn. He attacks all enemies again. Has a 50% chance of placing the weak version of decreased speed on a 3-turn cooldown. And then attacks all enemies again. Has a 75% chance, 100 when booked, on a 4-turn cooldown of placing the 25% decrease attack debuff for 2 turns. And has a 100% when booked of placing the 30% decreased defense for 2 turns, all on a 4-turn cooldown. Moving on to the Lizardmen, the first one we have in the Lizardmen is Skink, and I pulled him, and I'm slowly building him up and playing around with him. But he attacks one enemy, but will ignore block damage or shields. That is huge. His A2 on a 3-turn cooldown has a 75% chance when booked of placing the weak version of decreased defense. Also places a 50% heal reduction debuff for 2 turns if the target already has decreased defense. So he's bringing a lot to the table. And then he attacks one enemy. If the hit is critical, if the target has a heal reduction debuff. Now, he does have a leadership that could be used in Doom Tower if you're running a magic team. If you're not running a magic team, it's really not going to benefit you and other than him. Got to talk about Bogwalker. A lot of people probably know about Bogwalker, but he attacks one enemy, has a 50% chance when booked of placing a 50% decrease attack debuff. That's the strong version of decreased attack. On his A2, attacks all enemies and places a 30% increased defense buff on all allies for 2 turns. That goes down to a 3-turn cooldown. Then his passive places a 30% reflect damage buff on all allies for 1 turn when he is hit with a critical hit. Last one I want to talk about is Harrowspecs. Harrowspecs is a void, but he attacks one enemy 2 times. Each hit has a 35% chance of placing a 2.5% poison debuff, so he's applying poisons on his basic. His A2 fills the turn meter of all allies by 15% and then places a 15% increased speed buff on all allies for 2 turns on a 3-turn cooldown. And then his A3 revives a dead ally with 30% HP and fills their turn meter by 30% on a 5-turn cooldown. Moving on to Skinwalkers, I want to start with Blood Painter, and his A1 attacks one enemy 2 times. When booked, it's a 25% chance of placing the strong version of poison for 1 turn, getting a little something extra off his basic. Then, on his A2, on a 3-turn cooldown, has a 40% chance when booked of placing the 50% decrease accuracy debuff for 2 turns, and then fills the turn meter of all allies on a 4-turn cooldown, except for this champion, by 20%. Places a 25% increase attack buff on all allies for 2 turns. Next one up in Skinwalkers is Gnarlhorn, and I have to start by saying he's an HP-based champion. so he's going to be easier to keep alive. On his A1, damage increases according to how much HP this champion has lost. This attack cannot be strong, critical, or weak hit. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is, you know, he's a rare. He's an HP-based champion, but the more hits he takes and what he does, he's going to do more damage. But no matter the affinity you take him in against, doesn't even matter if it's his weak affinity, he's not going to land a weak hit, but he's also not going to land a critical hit. And early in the game, you don't have a lot of the gear required, so you can't get his crit rate up as high as you want to anyways, but that gives you a chance to put HP gloves on instead of crit rate gloves. So he's easier to gear off of his A1. His A2, on a 3-turn cooldown, he places a provoke debuff on all enemies for 1 turn. Places a 30% increased defense buff on this champion for 2 turns. Then his A3 places an unkillable buff on this champion for 3 turns. The next champion I want to talk about is Grappler, a defensive-based champion, so easier to keep alive. He attacks 2 times at random and has a 15% chance, 25 when booked, of placing the weak version of Weaken. So Weaken means every time somebody attacks them, they do more damage, and it's for 2 turns on a basic. A2 attacks 1 enemy 2 times. Each hit has a 50% chance, 75 when booked, on a 3-turn cooldown of placing the weak version of Poison. And then A3 places a shield buff on all allies equal to 20% of their turn or their HP, and then a 15% reflect damage buff on all allies for 2 turns on a 4-turn cooldown. Then he has an aura, which is only for Spirit Affinity champions, but he increases HP in all battles by 19%. So moving on to Orcs, I want to talk about Ironclad, another HP-based champion. A1 attacks 1 enemy, has a 40% chance of placing a 100% heal reduction debuff for 2 turns. Now this attack is based on HP and attack, so that is kind of easier to gear early in the game. And then he removes a random debuff from all allies on his A2 on a 3-turn cooldown, and then places an increase attack buff at 25% on all allies for 2 turns. His passive, when healed, will attack all enemies, inflicting damage proportional to his surplus heal. Damage inflicted is equal to 50% of any surplus heal. So if he's at full health and you heal him, he's only going to get 50% of that damage. Then he has an aura of increasing HP in all battles by 16%. That's only going to help him because he's an HP-based champion. I want to talk about Wyvernbane next. Her A1 attacks 1 enemy, has a 20% chance, 30 when booked, of placing a 15% decreased speed debuff for 2 turns. A2 attacks 1 enemy, has a 35% chance, 50 when booked, on a 3-turn cooldown of decreasing the target's turn meter by 20%. And then on a 4-turn cooldown, when booked, attacks this enemy, has a 100% chance of placing HP burn debuff for 2 turns, so you can use that for the Frost Spider if you're lacking the HP burn. She can come in handy. The last one here I want to talk about is Veteran. He is a Void, and you do seem to pull him a little more regularly in Voids. At least I do. But he attacks 1 enemy, has a 50% chance when booked of placing a 50% decrease attack debuff for 2 turns, and damage inflicted is proportional to defense. So he will survive longer. You can really amp up that defense. You probably have some defensive gear laying around. You can probably put that on him. His A2, he attacks 1 enemy, places a 30% increased crit rate buff on all allies for 3 turns if he kills the target. And then attacks all enemies on his A3 on a 3-turn cooldown, and has a 60% chance when booked of placing a blocks buff debuff for 1 turn. Damage increases according to this champion's max HP. Moving on to Demonspawn, we got to talk about Diabolist. She is a farmable character, so you can book her out pretty quickly. And she attacks 1 enemy, has a 20% chance when booked of placing a sleep debuff for 1 turn. So we have some crowd control. Attacks all enemies, places a 30% increased speed buff on all allies for 2 turns on a 3-turn cooldown when booked, and fills the turn meter of all allies on her A3 on a 4-turn cooldown by 15%, decreasing the turn meter of all enemies by 15%. So she's that turn meter manipulation. Next one up is Marquise, and she is a defensive-based champion, so more survivable. The A1 attacks one enemy, has a 25% chance of placing a 25% decrease attack debuff for 2 turns, and that can go up to a 30% chance when booked. Her A2, she attacks all enemies, so we got an AoE, and has a 50% chance when booked of placing that 15% weaken debuff for 2 turns, and deals extra damage to enemies with the weaken debuff. So more damage for your whole team. And then attacks one enemy, has a 100% chance when booked of placing a freeze debuff for 1 turn on a 4-turn cooldown. And then we have Fellhound, Void, very, very good character. Attacks all enemies on the A1, has a 25%, 35 when booked of placing a 15% decreased speed debuff for 1 turn. He is a defensive-based champion, going to be easier to keep alive. Then he places a 7.5% continuous heal buff on his A2 on a 2-turn cooldown, and a 15% reflect damage buff on all allies for 2 turns, so when you book him out, you can keep up your continuous heals all the time, and then places a block damage buff on an ally for 1 turn on a 3-turn cooldown. On to Undead Hordes, we have Banshee. Banshee could be a solid character for somebody, because on her A1, she has an AoE, has a 30% chance of placing the 30% decreased defense debuff for 1 turn. A2, again, she attacks all enemies, has a 70 or 65% chance of removing 1 random buff from each target on a 2-turn cooldown when booked. And then her A3 attacks 2 times at random. Each attack has a 50% chance of placing a block cooldown skills debuff for 1 turn on a 3-turn cooldown. Next one I want to talk about is Grinner. Grinner is A1, attacks 1 enemy, has a 25% chance of placing a 50% increased attack debuff or buff on all allies for 2 turns on a basic. His A2 on a 3-turn cooldown has a 50% chance when booked of removing 1 random buff from each target. A2 or A3 revives an ally with 50% HP, places a shield buff on the revived champion for 2 turns, equal to 20% of their max health on a 4-turn cooldown. We have to talk about Doomscreech, who is a Void, and he is just so good. His A1 attacks 1 enemy 2 times, has a 25%, 40% when booked of placing a 50% decreased accuracy debuff for 2 turns. His A2 on a 3-turn cooldown fills the turn meter of all allies by 30% and places the strong version of increased defense buff on all allies for 2 turns. A3 attacks all enemies, places a shield buff equal to 30% max HP on this champion for 2 turns. Damage increases according to this champion's current. And I'm giving you a bonus one on Undead Hordes because Seducer could be good for your team. A1 attacks an enemy, has a 45% chance when booked of placing a sleep debuff for 1 turn. A2 attacks all enemies, has a 100% chance when booked on a 3-turn cooldown of placing a 25% decreased attack debuff for 2 turns. A3 places a 30% increased defense buff on all allies for 2 turns, and a block debuff buff on all allies for 2 turns on a 4-turn cooldown. And then he has an ally HP in all battles by 25% for an aura, so I had to put him in there as an honorable mention. He can do some things for you. Dark Elves, Kale, got to talk about Kale. Best starter champion out there. He does have the aura, we'll start with that, of all allies HP in battles is increased by 15%. He puts on the weak version of poison at a 90 or 100% chance when booked for 2 turns. He has a very good AoE on a 3-turn cooldown, and then he has an extra 15% chance of inflicting a critical hit, and then he fills his turn meter by 25% for each enemy killed, so he can definitely help you out, clear out those waves. And then he attacks 4 times at random, so if you're going against a boss, he can attack the boss 4 times, places a 40% chance up to 50 when booked on a 4-turn cooldown of placing the strong version of poison for 2 turns. Spirit Host is a farmable character, and we have to mention her just simply because she does provide a speed aura in all battles by 10%, but she brings a little bit more than that to the table. She heals by 50% of the damage inflicted on her basic. She places a 50% increased attack buff on all allies for 2 turns on a 3-turn cooldown when booked. And then she removes all debuffs from all allies and places a block debuffs on all allies for 1 turn on a 5-turn cooldown. We have to talk about Coldheart. I don't have her on either account, and I wish I did, But her A1, she attacks 4 times at random. Each hit is a 25%, 35 when booked, of placing a 100% heal reduction debuff for 2 turns. Art of Pain, her A2, attacks all enemies, has a 35% chance when booked on a 3-turn cooldown of placing a 50% decreased accuracy debuff, and then places a 5% poison debuff for 2 turns when the target is under a heal reduction debuff. But her Heartseeker, on a 4-turn cooldown when booked, attacks 1 enemy, decreases the target's turn meter by 100%. Has an extra 30% chance of inflicting a critical hit on this attack, and the damage increases according to the max HP, so she is just a nuker. And another honorable mention for the Dark Elves is Painkeeper. We gotta talk about Painkeeper. She attacks 1 enemy 2 times, fills this champion's turn meter by 10%. Attacks all enemies, then heals all allies by 15% of this champion's max HP. She is an HP-based champion. This is a 4-turn cooldown, and that heal can get all the way up to, well, let's see, 15, 30, 40, 55%, so she can do some work. And then her A3 decreases cooldowns of all ally skills by 1 turn, and that is on a 4-turn cooldown. Knight Revenant, we have to talk about Executioner. Again, he's a farmable champion, and he is defensive based, so that could help you out quite a bit to keep him alive. He attacks 1 enemy, has a 15% chance, and that goes all the way up to a 30% chance of placing a stun debuff for 1 turn when he is booked out. He attacks all enemies and decreases their turn meter by 20%. This is on a 3-turn cooldown, and he also has a 75% chance when booked of placing that 15% decreased speed debuff for 2 turns. And then on a 5-turn cooldown, when booked, he places a 60% increased defense buff and counterattack buff on himself for 3 turns. So if you're going against those AoE waves, he can counter them all. Then his aura increases defense in all battles by 17%. That increases your survivability for your whole team. Final one I want to talk about in Knight Revenant is Acolyte. Acolyte attacks 1 enemy, but he fills this champion's turn meter by 25%. On his A2, he attacks 1 enemy, has a 75% chance. That goes up to a 90% chance of decreasing the target's turn meter by 50%. And then his A3, he removes all debuffs on all allies on a 4-turn cooldown. First one up on Dwarves I want to talk about is Runic Warder, and a lot of you people already know about Runic Warder, but if you don't, he attacks 1 enemy 2 times. On his A1, he is an HP-based champion, and then attacks 1 enemy 2 times. Each hit has a 30%, goes up to a 50% chance when booked of placing a 50% decrease attack debuff for 2 turns, and then on his A3 places a 15% reflex damage buff and a 7.5 continuous heal buff on all allies for 2 turns on a 3-turn cooldown. Next one up is Avir the Alchemage. If you're missing that healer type and you have him, he attacks 1 enemy. On his basic, has a 30% chance, that goes up to 45 when booked, of placing the strong version of poison for 2 turns. And then his A2, he attacks all enemies, has a 100% chance when booked on a 3-turn cooldown of placing a 25% decrease attack debuff for 2 turns. He also places a 15% decreased speed debuff on 1 turn if that target's under poison. So you pair him with a Kale or something like that, really help you out. And then he fills the turn meter of all allies by 15% and heals all allies by 15% of this champion's max HP on a 4-turn cooldown. So next one up I want to talk about is Delalore Lorekeeper. I really like this character for a rare. He is a support champion, but he attacks 1 enemy, has a 25% chance. That goes up to 45% when booked of placing that block cooldown skills debuff for 1 turn. On his A2, he attacks 1 enemy, has a 40% chance of placing a stun debuff. That goes up to 50% when booked on a 3-turn cooldown if they are under any debuff, and most of the time they are, so that is awesome. And then A3 places a 15% continuous heal buff on all allies for 2 turns. Also places a block debuffs on the target ally for 1 turn if they have less than 100% health on a 4-turn cooldown. And then he has an increase ally HP in all battles by 15%. And another honorable mention here is Dilgal. We got to talk about Dilgal. He's a great Void rare. Attacks 1 enemy, has a 40% chance, that's 50% when booked, of placing a 15% decreased speed debuff on a basic. He attacks all enemies on a 3-turn cooldown, has a 75% chance of placing a 50% decrease accuracy debuff for 2 turns. And then on his big game hunter, he has a 65% chance of placing a 60% decreased defense buff for 3 turns on a 4-turn cooldown. So my YouTube family, there it is. There is 3 rares with a couple bonuses from each faction that could help you out in Doom Tower early on before you get those epics and legendaries. And a lot of these characters can be phased out over time. There's only a select few that can't. With that being said, I just want to thank everybody for the support that you're showing me as I start branching out and doing more Raid Shadow Legends videos. It's been overwhelming. I got a lot of people DMing me and talking to me about it. And if you really want to try this game out and you haven't done it before, we have a guild, XMG Fam, clan, same thing. Jump into that. It's really, you can do what you want. We're in there for people to try it out and see if they like it, and we progress, and we have a lot of fun. So feel free to join that. So with that being said, if you're just finding me for the first time and you're liking what you're seeing, click that subscribe button. Join the XMG family. For my XMG family members out there, you know I love you. I'll see y'all in the next one. I'm out.